I'm Nicole Dove, Head of Security for the Games Division at Riot Games and proud board member of CyberSaint. And today we're going to talk about a couple of very interesting and timely things. So, because of the rapidly evolving regulatory landscape, cybersecurity has evolved from a horizontal function connecting business units. And it's now a lever that we leverage to inform strategic decision making, really requiring a new approach of cross collaboration and innovation that is led by CISOs and security leaders and practitioners. I am super excited to host today's panel, as not only is the subject matter timely, but we have carefully curated a collective of cybersecurity leaders to share their insights on how they navigate this new normal. Now, as our session moves along, feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A feature, as we'll leave some time at the end for the session panelists to answer some questions. Let me just start by introducing who our lovely panelists are. So first we have Angela Hong. She is Chief Risk Officer at Munich Re America Service. Welcome, Angela. We've got Lavon Burke, who's VP of Security and Resilience at Dell Technologies. Hey, Lavon.
Hi, welcome.
And we've got Patrick O'Reilly, CyberSaint's own co-founder and chief product officer. We've got 1 hour today. We've got some really good questions. I want to make sure we generate a lot of great discussions. Let us know how you're feeling in the chat as we go along. I'm going to get started and jump into the question. I'm going to start with you, Angela. Let's just level
Yep.
set. How do you define cyber risk?
So I may have cheated and got some of the questions before. No, but I thought let's go to a core definition, right? So our very own NITS describes cybersecurity risks as an effect of uncertainty on or within information and technology. Cybersecurity risks relate to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information, data, or information or control systems, and reflect the potential adverse impacts to organizational operations. All
Mhm.
those things: mission, functions, image, reputation, assets, individuals, and other organizations. Now, when I think about cybersecurity risk for myself, I'm hoping when everybody, starts their morning, they turn on their laptop and it works, right? We haven't been infiltrated by the bad actors and everybody can get on with their day. And these are the things that we're thinking about so that the business can run. And that would be my simple term. But I thought we'd go to a core, give our NITS friends a heads up there that we were thinking about them too. So,
Can't go wrong with
mm-mm,
NIST. It's kind of like our
no.
cybersecurity Bible, right?
Right, right. What did they say? Yes.
Yes. Patrick, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on cybersecurity risk as well.
Yeah, well, I can't improve on NIST definition, given that I'm not 500 scientists.
Sorry, Patty. Yeah.
But that's all right. It's a beautiful definition, and I agree with it. I would just qualify it by saying that it's grown up a bit. So it's matured a bit. Cyber risk was understood to be sort of likelihood and impact, and it was a heat map, and that was the old GRC table stakes. It's expanded from there quite a bit. We're folding in actuarial data now. We're looking at other dynamic risk models. We're looking across the organization, across many technologies, across the stack. And it is the understanding you ultimately want to give to your senior leadership around what the possible scenarios you might face are, so that you can make proper resourcing decisions. So that's my spin on what Angela said.
I like them both. I like them both, right? It's not only what could go wrong, but like how prepared are we to deal with it? And what is the impact to our operations, our customers, and sometimes even our communities, right? Like we're seeing cyber attacks on different government agencies and utility companies, and they have a significant downstream impact on just like the quality of life, right? So
Absolutely.
I totally agree, Patty. It definitely has grown up a bit. Now, from a regulatory perspective, the landscape continues to evolve as it always did, but now we're seeing it evolve exponentially. So, Lavon, I want to point to you for this one. Talk to me about how the ever evolving regulatory landscape has impacted you and your role. And is there one development that has impacted you more than the others?
Sure. So I would say that I spend probably 60 to 70% of my time on regulatory compliance these days.
Mhm.
I would say that probably 2017 to 2019, there may have been maybe 3 to 4 regulations that we were really looking at. Some of those not really cybersecurity regulations like privacy, GDPR, some others. From 2021 to now, there are about 30 to 35 kind of very significant, what I would call material, country level regulations that have come out in the space of cybersecurity, product security, covering third-party risk management. So the regulatory landscape here is something that I think has not been seen, and the rapid level and speed at which it is advancing, and everyone is really jumping on the cybersecurity bandwagon and digital supply chain security bandwagon, something we really haven't seen before. So it is a tremendous amount. I mean, and for multinational companies, we're dealing with those type of regulations across the world. It's by industry vertical. So, if you have customers that are in critical infrastructure, financial services, all those other industries that are regulated, you also have to deal with those, right? And try to make sure that you are compliant to meet your clients' compliance or your customers' compliance. So, I mean, it's just coming from every direction. And so managing that spider web of just such a fragmented regulatory environment where there's not full harmonization across all those regulations is really, really difficult and really challenging, particularly when a lot of organizations don't have the funding that they need and the resource and headcount in the legal department and the compliance departments to be able to manage that level of regulatory compliance. This is a new space where companies are becoming regulated where they weren't before. We in the tech industry, we're in a regulated industry. We are inevitably becoming a regulated industry now just by default and how many regulations are out there. So we have to move very cautiously in those spaces and to make sure that you keep market competitiveness, because your clients want that level of oversight. And this number one question that's asked by our customers is about regulatory compliance. So it's definitely something that I think everyone has to be aware of. This is a nascent area of law that's rapidly developing, but we're in for a landslide of just tremendous amount of deluge, really, of regulatory compliance related issues. The one that you asked, what am I most concerned about, or the one that I think is the top of my mind right now, is really the SEC cyber disclosure rule that came out. I know everyone has been talking about that. I've been following it for quite a while, was involved in a lot of the, kind of rulemaking submissions and commentaries. It really is something that I think is going to kind of blow the door off of regulatory compliance and cybersecurity for a lot of companies that are regulated and subject to the SEC and are registrants. And the reason I say that is it's not so much about the disclosure obligations around cybersecurity incidents, because we've had those for many years. And the regulations and the requirements there haven't changed that much, other than the definitive timeline in which you have to make a disclosure around a material security incident. What has changed is that you have to open the door and show everyone what's in your cyber risk management closet and how you are integrating cybersecurity risk management in your organization, what your practices are, what your policies are, how you're making decisions based upon that, who is involved in those decisions from both a management and a board level, what kind of expertise your management team has related to cybersecurity risk management and third-party risk management, all of these things which really companies have been doing. Maybe they're doing it well, maybe they're not doing it well, but you're going to be on the hook for those disclosures now.
Right.
And so if you are deficient in really what you're doing, you open the door potentially for shareholder derivative suits, as well as, increasing the level of liability that is potentially imparted upon your board of directors. So I really do think that this is, while it's not, de facto a true cybersecurity rule that's related to disclosures, it is going to regulate this industry even more, or all industries really, for publicly traded companies even more. And so that's the one that I would say, of all the regulations that I'm managing, the one that gives me the most pause, just because of what I think the downstream impact is going to be.
I agree. I think a lot of us security leaders are spending a lot of time, first of all, trying to decipher and understand all of these regulations. And to your point, Lavon, it does put a significant strain on our legal and privacy teams, right? Angela, is there any that sticks out to you that's really impacted you more than the others, or do you agree with Lavon on the same item?
Well, a little different space. So Munich Re is coming from the insurance industry. And for those of you in the insurance industry, one of your favorite sayings is probably NYDFS 500. So the New York State Department of Financial Services issued the NYCRR 500 cybersecurity requirement in 2017. And literally out of that created new jobs. We had jobs that didn't exist. Our cyber risk manager, our cyber risk analyst, you had maybe spaces in IT where you were thinking about the cybersecurity protocols and actual tools, but to be part of that risk side where you're talking about the documentation and evidence and reporting, similar to what Lavon was saying, it's completely new. And that's where we're spending most of our time. I mean, I'm creating a role right now that will further support the next round of demands that are coming from where we see each individual state within the insurance industry be regulating cybersecurity and those cybersecurity reporting requirements on top of Munich Re as an international reinsurers who are also subject to European requirements, such as BaFin, and are going through a massive global cybersecurity program to really elevate all protocols and the way that we look at our cybersecurity as really across the world, so that we can make sure that we're operating at a level that's expected by the regulator, but also disclosing that and making sure as one of the leaders in the space, we're on top of those next steps and thinking about really setting the precedent on what this looks like for many insurance companies globally. So yes, NYDFS 500 is a constant saying within our space.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. And so there begins to be a downstream impact once these laws and regulations are passed, right?
Absolutely.
So one of them, if we talk about starting from the top, they're going to be increased expectations from the board, right? I've never gotten so many questions from leadership in the board about cybersecurity. Can you talk to me, Lavon, about how you enhance what you present to the board from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, I think the kind of key piece of all of this is board training. And
Mhm.
so it is really up leveling and upskilling your board on cybersecurity in general. I think a lot of the boards got pretty good primers around 2018, 2019 or so related to privacy and GDPR, but many of them don't understand fundamentally the differences between privacy and cybersecurity. And we're really talking about the security of the entire data set. We're talking about, availability and resiliency, everything else that goes along with cybersecurity, and potentially that you're talking about really significant business interruption. So I think there is a lot of very initial thresholding and information that has to happen to really up level and upskill the level of the board. Because
Mhm.
even though this specific SEC regulation didn't come out, there was some talk before, the first draft where they wanted to know board level experience. They kind of walked that back a little bit and said, we want to know management level experience. There's also been some conversations floating around about requirements to have someone on your board that has experience in
Mhm.
cybersecurity. It's
Mhm.
kind of a de facto way of getting that to that point too, right?
Yeah.
So you are really going to, if you don't have someone on the board that has a expertise in cybersecurity, you're going to have to create some expertise there. And it may not have to be that, they're a former CISO or something, but they need to have at least that baseline fundamental knowledge. So I think that's step one. I think the other part really is in part of the communications, ensuring that they're informed of the appropriate risk, right? Because they have a duty of loyalty. They have a duty of care, particularly under Delaware law. They have expanded some of the requirements under Delaware law that relate to what those board members and directors and officers are responsible for doing, and what level of duty that they have related to cybersecurity risk. And before it was something where it was just related to kind of corporate risk, but they've expanded that now recently with some of the recent Uber cases and SolarWinds, where they're now saying this also extends, and this level of duty of care and duty of loyalty also extends over to your board for cybersecurity related issues. So helping them to understand, what their duty is, that they need to know and understand these cyber risks, that they potentially are going to be responsible for them if, there are unfortunate circumstances that happen, that the right steps weren't taken, that they didn't ask the right questions. And I think to that last point is teaching them to ask the right questions, right?
Yep.
And so helping seed them with the information that they know so they can just ask, why did you do that? How are we handling this? What are we doing to mitigate these risks? They do that in a lot of other areas, but many boards, and even many boards of many publicly traded companies, the board members are not asking that because they don't quite have that level of sophistication with respect to cyber risk. And so I think a lot of what fundamentally has to happen right now is really a robust educational process so that you can even set the stage to allow them to understand what you're going to present at a later period of time.
I love how you broke this down, because we immediately think about like board reporting and what am I going to share to the board? But we've got to stop and take a step back and look at the structure of our board, right? Look at who's required to be on that board. And a lot of times, to your point, Levon, folks on our boards are not technology or cybersecurity experts, right? They're business people. So we have to think about how to connect the dots for them, right, with regulation and what that means operationally, and then getting them in the groove of asking the right questions that are going to ultimately lead for them to make the decisions or influence us as leaders to move in the path that we need to. So I love that holistic way of thinking about your board, who's on it, knowing your audience, catering the message, and then getting them up to speed.
Yep.
Patty, I would love to hear your perspective on this, maybe even from a product perspective, right, for the cyber offerings. Yeah, let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are, really in line with what Levon said. It's things have really changed in cyber risk. The SEC decision is bringing this to the fore. It's sort of like we're leaving the era of, I don't want to know about it, I don't want to hear about it. Just keep it over there, and we can, figure it out if something goes wrong. That's not the case anymore. And when it comes to reporting, we work with a lot of system integrators, MSPs, large multinationals, and they show us the reports. They show us, what they use to communicate with the board. And we've done a lot of work in product over the last year to put in sort of the base theorem of what you would present to the senior leadership. So it's translation across a lot of data, right? It's translation across the risk models, it's translation across the CSF, it's translation across maturity models, it's translation across a new release we have, which we call risk remediation workflow, which answers the question, what do we do, with these exposures? So the product has grown up a bit in that, what we're presenting as the reporting is part of that educational process. So we're enriching sort of what they're doing in compliance and risk with external data, with actuarial data, with automated controls, and simplifying that at the level of the board reporting and the C-suite reporting. It has to be sort of, almost a textbook on cyber risk, as well as a set of dynamic reports that are fed by live data. So what Levon said is fascinating because, this is a process that's going to occur over time. There's going to be a lot of pressure, on executives in that 10K because it's going to be out in the open. Now, they were pretty specific at the SEC. They said, you don't have to say you're using the CSF. You don't have to say you're using a risk model out of the 830 series. You don't have to say X, Y, and Z. But, the companies that do get a little more specific on how they're actually managing it from the policy and procedural level, how they protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, how they go about that, and how they make decisions around resourcing mitigations or the buying of insurance or the transference of risk, what they can accept, what their risk appetite is. The companies that can talk kind of fluently about that are going to see, their equity protected, because cybersecurity really is a business driver, and its time has come in regulation like this. So.
Completely agreed. Couldn't have said it better myself. So we've talked about the board level, right? Let's take it a step down, because these regulations may or may not require operational changes in the workplace. So Angela, can you talk to us about how security leaders can effectively lead that cross collaboration to drive these changes across different parts of the business?
I think it really has to start with continuous conversations, right? Initially, you have to understand where your gaps and your weaknesses are. So if you haven't done some sort of an independent assessment where, you're doing a spiderweb look at, over the 30 capabilities around cyber and knowing where your weaknesses are, and then sitting down with IT, risk management, legal, compliance, understanding what your total budget is and kind of deciding where we should attack first, like where do we get the most bang for our buck, if you will. But it has to come from an organized project plan, all the key stakeholders involved, and like I said, continuing the conversation. It's not just a one-time, fix. The bad guys, the bad actors are constantly changing. Therefore, our cybersecurity protocols have to keep changing. So making sure that we're having the appropriate coverage and space and budget to really protect our crown jewels, knowing what those crown jewels are, making sure we understand from the business that they what do they want to protect. It has to, you have to bring people together and keep it going. And even once it's a project plan, it probably ends up being new roles and new FTEs, and then continuing that through. Really,
Yeah,
it doesn't
yeah,
stop.
yeah. I'm a very practical kind of style leader, and so I'm always focused on like what are those core foundational elements, right? Because
Yes.
those are the things that really get us in trouble. LaVon or Patty, I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I will say operational changes that are necessary is enhancing your legal team in this area. And so that's one that's often overlooked. A lot of companies, I think, thought that they could potentially grow some of this, organically in-house and just add it on and bolt it on to existing, legal resources. That's not really the case. This is a really highly specialized area that takes a lot of integration. The same thing as, cybersecurity professionals. You need the legal team that actually has that same level of expertise that is kind of functioning in both spaces. It has the cyber expertise as well as the legal expertise, really to be able to come in and help guide. And so I think from an operational perspective, understanding that that is a evolving need. And if you haven't already started looking for lawyers that have experience in cybersecurity, that is very distinct from lawyers that have experience just in privacy, right? But making sure that skill set is brought into the legal department is really critically important. And then I think also too, the compliance functions really, some of these compliance functions haven't been focused as much related to cybersecurity compliance and cybersecurity regulations, really making sure that that part of your GRC function is staffed appropriately to be able to conduct all the gap assessments, put the remediation plans in place, work very closely with government affairs and with, the legal department really to be able to do that. And I guess that would be the last part, making sure that it's added to your government affairs list for those companies that have government affairs departments, making sure that they're looking here and really advocating in this space for organizations. So I think operationally, those are some areas too that a lot of companies may not be thinking about that they need to be expanding and really looking in a forward-leaning manner. But those are some other areas that I would say are equally as important to make sure you have support in.
And I'd also add, like, we have to test it. So once you get some sort of program up and running, are you doing tabletop testing? Are you bringing together all those key people and actually testing your plan? Does everybody know what to do when there is an incident? Do you have all the people in place? Can you contact everyone? This stuff isn't going to happen on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:00. It's going to happen on Christmas Eve or, 4th of July. Like the bad guys know when everybody wants to be out of the office. So do you have your backups in place? So not just your key people, but your delegates. And are you actively testing this and making sure and surprising everyone that, it's going to happen when we're not going to be the most ready? And can you bring everybody together, all of those stakeholders, and make sure that you can quickly, mitigate and respond and potentially communicate? It could end up in a press release as well. Is everybody ready?
Agreed. Because it definitely happens on the 3-day weekends and
Yes,
extended
it does.
holidays.
Every Labor Day weekend, or any of those weekends where holidays are heading into, I'm just like, let's just hold it together till Monday.
Coverage, right? Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got board, right? Then we broke it down to cross-functional collaboration across different lines of business and different teams. But now within that, I think, LaVon, you kind of hinted to this earlier. Now our teams have to build new capabilities as a result of these changes, right? And so now kind of the talent profile has now expanded. And to LaVon's point, it traditionally was, let's build it over buy it. But are you all seeing that change a bit?
I mean, we definitely are. There's definitely space where you have to take into consideration, does my current team have this expertise, or do I need to outsource this function? I really think about third-party risk management. It is a huge I'd say burden to take on cyber risk assessment of all of our third parties. And is that something that you want to bring in-house, or is it something you want to outsource to experts who have a consistent approach, a way to bring all the answers in and assess them and then give you some sort of a readout or report? We've leaned on SOC 2s for so many years, but now I think this third-party risk assessment is the next version of a SOC 2, where you're not just, talking about general operational controls, but really focusing on privacy, data management, cloud risk, resiliency. And I think not everyone has that ready to go in their IT department. You have to consider, do I need to do this quickly in order to meet that regulation that's going to be required within 1 year to report out? And I may need to lean on some outsourcing expertise here for sure.
I agree with that, Angela, and particularly with the amount of suppliers that are in supply base, right? For many companies, when you're talking about potentially tens of thousands of suppliers, trying to build that organically when your IT organizations, development organizations are really trying to run your business, it's really going to be hard to divert resources over to those type of projects. And whether or not that's not their core competency.
No,
with the exception of a couple of companies, right? Do you want them building your products, or do you want someone who actually has a competency? This is a space that they run in and they're familiar with, and they have the expertise to be able to do this and do it much faster, much quicker, likely much cheaper, for you to be able to acquire that solution. And for your point on a timing perspective, who are you really going to have time to set that up and then test it and make a determination? And then you've got a bespoke system that's likely going to be outdated. I would say the other part this is akin to now, and we're only going to see accelerate, is with now AI, right? Everyone is going towards AI. There are significant cybersecurity related issues associated with that as companies continue to integrate AI into their products, into their internal portfolios for productivity tools, all those kind of things, customer outreach, customer interfaces. The cybersecurity risks are going to continue to expand, and so really you need the expertise to be able to understand what those risks are and see kind of where the bird is going, and shoot for where it's going to be, not where it is currently. And really that's going to be very hard if you're looking to kind of just build that versus buying it. So, with the way that things are so rapidly changing, it's something that I think everyone really has to take a consideration in. And, it's not kind of calling your baby ugly and what you have internally, right? But it really is just trying to have a realistic viewpoint of that and say, what is in the best interest of the company? What's in the best interest of our clients? How can we meet this, and use the most prudence in getting us to the business outcome that we need?
And within your budget too. There's only, you cannot 110% protect against cybersecurity risk. It has to be that reasonable assurance level that we speak to, auditors speak to. So what is the balance there of what you can spend, what you're allocated, and really thinking about, I said earlier, the best bang for your buck, where my critical weaknesses are and how can I attack them in an appropriate way? And if I need to do that in efficiently and quickly so I can report out by 12/31, it's probably going to be to outsource it and really buy it.
Yeah, and I would say that, I agree completely. We used to get calls 4 or 5 years ago where programs would say, we're building this thing. Can you show us what you're building so that we can build something similar? And we had calls 4 or 5 years ago where we would show what we were building, and companies at the end of maybe 10 calls would say, well, we're going to build it, and they would go away. And, they come back to us now. And, I would just say also that, MSPs are the system integrators are all quite busy. There's a really cool thing, though, I think that's occurring as well in the, do we build our own versus do we outsource some of this? There's a 30% labor shortage in cyber. Everyone in cyber is completely overtaxed. I think it's pretty well understood that, using software or services or some combination thereof to get increased efficiencies is the way to go. But I also see, the more mature programs saying, okay, look, if we're going to bring someone in, let's make sure we've got this in a system or a system of record that we can mature over time, that it isn't just this sort of one-off deliverable, right? That the program that they leave behind, it isn't just one person in a closet, overseas somewhere who understands the model. Let's make this a part of the entire organization. And we've been a part of many of those projects. And, I think that's the way to go. And on the smaller side, where they've always been understaffed, when you hit them with DFARS or any set of regulations, and they're in, say, the 0 to 50 million range, their maturity, they need extra help. they need, you to bring extra data to them in order to even build a program. So we're seeing a lot of that as well. And, I'm optimistic about some of the sea change around maturity and working with third parties.
I love it and by it, I mean the buy instead of build on the front end of our process and on the back end. Because at whether you are scaling your maturity, gearing up your program, looking to get in alignment with whatever framework, you take the legwork out of identifying where you are, right? Like, which is half the battle. Then on the second hand, you want to make sure that where you choose to focus your efforts and energy have impact. And what better way to come back to that same product, right, that you can rely on to get that feedback and then figure out where you need to make shifts. So many companies are spending time building scorecards, which, and we all know that metrics in our industry is like always a hot topic. So being able to shift, that utilization and that workforce to actually doing that in between work is significantly powerful. And I think it's really just a smart decision. So I agree with each of you. So bad actors have one job, right? Regulators pretty much do as well, but security leaders, we just have so many responsibilities, right? I think if you asked all of us for 25 things that we can work on in our organizations, we would probably give you double that. So as security leaders, right, what best practices do you use to stay ahead of those bad actors and aligned with the regulators while running your company's security or product functions?
Well, I can pick up on that.
Yeah.
In 2017 when we founded the company, we went to the cybersecurity framework, a convention, and back then it was more of a food fight. It was sort of what are we going to use to measure? How do we measure it? What model do we use to measure it? It was really interesting. Panels were up. There were disagreements about how much work had to go into measuring. Everyone was quoting. Some were saying it was Lord Kelvin. Others said it was Maxwell. You can't manage what you can't measure. So I think right now, though, there's been a sea change. There are some widely understood frameworks. Some of them come out of regulatory. I just worked on an RFI for the White House because they put it out on harmonization, and they asked one question, like how many standards in relation to cyber do you see out there? And I just went into the product and I listed all the ones I could find in the product. Some of them I've built, some of them I've updated. It's copious, right? It's copious, and it leads to a kind of sprawl with respect to things. But on the technology side, there are ways to relate frameworks together. You can, in theory, build a program now that baselines yourself on one of the good standards. You can use the CSF, you can use the CSF augmented with 853. You can use, sys controls. You can use whatever you want. And you can translate that into some regulatory standards as well and, hit a few dimensions. The same is true on the risk side. Risk has grown up quite substantially. So our practice has always, the market in cyber was, we want to own the score that everyone will need to, understand cyber risk. We took a very different approach because we talked to so many practices. Our approach was to be flexible, and I think that's true across the board with, how companies are solving these problems. They have to be flexible as well, and programs are going to vary, right? But there are a lot of really good standards out there. There are a lot of ways to benchmark risk that are better than the old, sort of like, wet finger in the air thing. There's a lot of ways to do it now. And there are a lot of things coming down the line to help cybersecurity professionals, like automation, the automation of controls, the enrichment of data on programs that can really help in this area. I don't think the problem is a lack of great standards or a lack of great best practices. The problem is that everyone in cyber is totally overworked. So the answer is greater efficiency.
I love that. Definitely greater efficiency. And to your point, flexibility, right? Because we all know, you can have something that you're deeply focused on, but when an event happens, everything shifts significantly. Angela, what are your thoughts on staying ahead of the bad actors and doing all the other things that we're tasked with doing?
I mean, you can't do this alone. And even within your company, even within your industry, we're all, you think about solar winds. I'm recalling the most recent one. It just dropped out of my mind, but it happened across all industries. So the bad guys aren't looking for one spot to get. We're all subject to it. So you have to utilize your networking, think about different committees you can be on. I mean, the news, you have to stay alert and kind of get out of your own heads down looking maybe at just a risk framework. You need to understand what's happening out there in the industry. We participate in the Advanced Cybersecurity Center. It's a great kind of bringing together of cyber executives, risk officers, legal teams. It's how I met some of the fabulous people on this panel. That is a great way to just come together, in a I guess our own safe space and kind of share what trends we're seeing, what best practices we're trying to implement within our companies, and really just connect with others. Because when I left one of the sessions, I was like, wow, it feels good to know that I'm not alone in this. We're not alone in this, and that we're all facing it. And even Levon talking about SEC, I'm not subject to SEC, but I'm seeing the very same things within my insurance space, right? We're seeing the regulators all aligned to, they want to understand where your cyber protocols are at, where your cybersecurity standards are, and they want them disclosed. So pretty much all of it's going to be out there where everybody's at. And then on the other side, you're like, well, are we disclosing it to the bad guys? But you know,
Mhm.
our policyholders, our shareholders need to understand, where our cybersecurity levels are at. So I don't think it's a bad thing to disclose, but we need to know that that's now out there, right? So then coming
Mhm.
together with others and thinking about what next steps are, seeking out professionals like CyberSaint, right? These are good things to do and understand how we can stay on top of what we need to, what the best practices and protocols are to protect our companies.
I agree. That idea sharing goes
Yeah,
very far.
you're not
It's
alone.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. That's the thing. I went to a security leader meetup in my local town last week, and one of the discussions was around AI. I know we had another session on AI as well. Um,
Hmm.
I was shocked at how many people had the same sentiment, because for a while I felt like maybe I'm just not looking at this right. Right. But
Right.
then when I understand that people have the same challenges or the same thoughts and perspectives, it really, really helped me feel like, okay, I'm not alone. I'm on the right path. And maybe we can
Yes.
even talk through solutioning together. Right.
There
Which
are
is so.
resources out there. You're not alone in this. And, I realize that budgets are limited, right? So you might just be a standalone cyber risk manager by
Yeah.
yourself and facing these myriad of things, and it is overwhelming. But find these resources, and many times they're free, right?
Yeah.
Even your local governments, it's all out there. There, Google stuff. There's all these resources out there that you can get into and be part of best practices and be part of those conversations and figure out, what's next. What are the next steps I need to do? What should I be thinking about? Because it's
Mhm.
not about what we're in right now, it's about what's coming.
That's right.
And we all want to be on top of that. So
That's right. I agree. Levon, how are you staying ahead of the bad actors and doing all the other things?
Yeah, what I would say is, I think it takes an integrated approach, right? It takes an army. It is overwhelming day to day. The threat actors are smarter than we are and moving faster than we are. The regulators, like I said, are moving extremely rapid, and many of them oftentimes don't really have good insight into what actual true risks are and things that make sense from an operational perspective. And so you're dealing with a lot of bureaucracy, and political posturing and some of the regulations too that you're having to navigate. And so all of those things are just a challenge. And so I think it really does require taking an integrated approach. We work with our government affairs team, we work with our legal team, we work with our product engineering team, we work with our IT organization, security, of course, governance, risk, and compliance, all of those, where we have to bring all of those stakeholders to the table to be able to have conversations about what we should be doing, identifying and prioritizing risk. Because to your point, we can be doing everything we need to do, and we can be identifying the risk and saying this is what needs to happen. But if your businesses are not prioritizing remediation activities to try to keep you ahead of the game, then, and that's oftentimes not just within the cybersecurity organization, right? They're business functions that have to do things to make sure, and are oftentimes the weakest links in the chain. And so you have to try to make sure that it is a concerted effort. I think part of what I have found is really helpful is trying from a regulatory perspective. That's the part that I try to own, in particular in helping our teams understand what those minimum requirements are, setting, frameworks. I think one of the things that we've done recently is we took a look at all of the new regulations that have come out recently or are pending that set specific requirements on cyber risk management programs. Pulled all of those regulations out, pulled all of the cyber risk management requirements out of those regulations, and have put those together so that there is some fundamental baseline, commonalities to be able to say, these are the things that we need to have. And so when you're setting high watermarks for what like the minimum is, what you don't want to do is have to move your program up and down for individual jurisdictions, because that is just, it's problematic, right? And so you want to have a standard. You can always supplement and augment if you need to in certain spaces, but you don't want to have to do that. And so really trying to understand what those baseline requirements are and, assess those minimum controls that are required, I think is critically important. And because this is an area, again, that hadn't been regulated before, it was a best practice. It was kind of mandated, by CSF and whatnot, and ISO and these other, non-regulatory related frameworks. But now you actually are seeing it making its way into regulations where they are saying you have to have dedicated cyber risk management. Additionally, these are the escalation paths that have to have, and then these are the people that are ultimately going to be responsible for those. I think really trying to get that buy-in, and that's the other part. The other people that are also going to be responsible for this are your managers, directors, and officers. So helping them understand what their role is and bringing them to the table through tabletops, through risk escalations, through board, communications and executive level team communications is just really important, because you have to get everyone on board. No one wants a cybersecurity incident, but no one wants the aftermath of the regulatory investigation that's added on top of that after either, because then that is just where it gets magnified.
Yeah.
For everyone. And so I think it's really just trying to make sure that you have all those people together working in concert to the best that you can. And it really does take an integrated approach. If you do it in a siloed fashion, you're not going to get the same, the same level of integration, the same level of collaboration, and really, I think the same level of awareness. And so really having that collaborative approach with those stakeholders is just really critical. Yeah. It's no longer just the security team and the IT team that need to be leading those discussions. You have to have these other people at the table.
We hit this from three critical angles that I just want to call out and highlight, right? So Patty, we started talking about at the product level and really making sure that the products that you leverage really are going to enrich you with the intel that you need so you know where to focus. And then I love how Angela layered on, like, let's just not think about this independently, but like, what are our peers and competitors doing, and how can we share and showcase information that can help us advance what our approach is going to be? And then Levon perfectly closed it out with, all those things are amazingly important, but we've also got to get the business on board, right? Because now we get to a space where we can align what our priorities and initiatives are with where the business is heading, right? Because now that's where we really get that buy-in from them. And security then becomes a lot more proactive than necessarily reactive. Because if we know what our threats are, we know what our competitors are facing, and we know where our business is going, we are so much better positioned to enhance our resilience and be proactive about our approach from a security perspective that enables the business, as opposed to coming through on the back end and wanting to get all these onesie twosies done. So I love kind of that integrated approach across product, network, and business leaders. So let's talk a little bit about some of this intelligence. How can cyber leaders leverage cyber risk intelligence to the advantage of advancement and protecting their company's technology ecosystems? Angela, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yes. I mean, we've talked a lot today, but at the end of the day, we don't know what the bad actors are doing next, right? Where is our next weak point, which is what I spoke to a little bit earlier. And cyber risk management can never stop. It never sleeps. Doesn't matter if it's a holiday, like we said. But we have to combine those efforts of IT with risk management, with legal, to keep assessing, monitoring, testing, and just continuous updating of our tools. But at the end of the day, your first line is your people. So how are we educating all of the people who turn on those laptops and get into their email, first thing in the morning? We have to think about How are we training them? Do they know what to do when it comes to phishing emails? When they're out there, what are they clicking on? What are they not clicking on? Are they reporting those suspicious links, or something weird happening with my system to the appropriate people, whether it's IT or whether it's to the risk manager? So that educational awareness is so critical, because that's who's out there and really exposing you to your risk. It's your internal risk, even more so than the bad guys trying to do all the penetration, right? So I would really think and challenge do you have an educational campaign on cyber risk? Is there, once a month emails or weekly emails or training sessions, even thinking about what we're doing in hotels or airports, right? That awareness really needs to be there, and it starts with your people. So I would really encourage everyone to consider an educational campaign, for your first line of defense.
Pedro, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love hearing it from the operational side so much. That's and I get to do that when I'm on the phone with companies. I think for us, awareness and training is massive. Obviously, it hits so many different kinds of dynamic threats, right? And the threat actors are always updating and changing. And we work with the threat data. We augment the risk with the threat data. We try to give an idea of the scenarios that you can be facing. The big thing is, if you're going to do awareness and training, you need to be able to explain, I think, in some ways, what the return on investment is around those things, right? If you're going to be sending everyone, a lot of emails with sort of stealth links in them, or, videos that help them understand, don't click on everything. You have to explain to the executives why it's important to do it on the regular. You have to be able to explain, why certain vulnerabilities or certain crown jewels, you need an accurate asset register. As far as the things we've been talking about, regulations, controls, standards, you don't want to walk into the C-suite, product wise. We don't make the assumption that you're going to walk in and talk about our crosswalking function, which ate all the security language on the planet and relates every standard to every other standard. But you will want to talk about, look, we think if we do the X, Y, and Z, or we do A, B, and C, these two choices, we might have an opportunity to take down our annualized loss exposure significantly on this particular exposure. Given that they're always changing, you have to do some sort of recalculation of the risk on the fly. Have to look at trends. Is it up? Is it down? Is it in our sector? What does it look like? Some peer benchmarking as well. But I love open source threat intelligence because it comes with extra information. It comes with information that you can put in frameworks like MITRE. It comes with information that you can roll over into risk, and you can relate that back to controls. So in a way, it's part of the broader story about cyber risk and how it changes on a day-to-day basis, and what teams are facing and how to get the resources that they need.
Agree. Okay, this is awesome. So let's transition into a little bit of Q&A. We've got about 12 minutes left, and I think we've got enough. We can have some healthy discussion. Levon, I'm going to toss this one to you. How can one ensure that cyber events are escalated appropriately? And we got you on mute, Levon.
Thanks. It's critical before an incident happens that as part of your incident response plan, you have an escalation plan. And so you want to have it very clearly articulated who is in the chain of, communications for when incidents happen. But a lot of times, your incidents, people that are involved in that, you're making very quickly decisions, trying to mitigate business impact, keep people informed. You may need to involve your crisis management team and whatnot. But you may also have an obligation to escalate to auditors, external auditors. You may have a requirement, to escalate to your disclosure review committee to make a determination around materiality. I think now, again, the SEC rule is adding some additional clarity on that. And so it's really, really important, particularly in light of that rule, that you have a very clearly defined materiality evaluation decision matrix to really clearly articulate what your materiality trigger points are, what those are going to be. I saw there was a question that came in about, how do you discuss business risk and reputational risk? Reputational risk is going to be one of the materiality factors that needs to be included in your materiality assessment. And so now it would also need to be disclosed potentially to the SEC in a 8K filing if you have a security incident as a material risk if it presents itself that way. And so having people in that escalation chain that can help you determine that. Is it your head of communications? Right? Is it your head of security? All of those business functional leaders that are going to have that expertise to help come bring that to the table should be somewhere in the escalation chain. They may not need to be involved in every single incident. They may not need to be involved in non-material incidents, but you need to have them already identified, and you need to know who you need to be communicating with ahead of time. And then the flip side of that is too, understanding when you need to go to your board and when they need to be communicated to, when you need to go to your executive leadership team, your CEO, to your board. But that all should be documented ahead of time. I would tell you, I was like, oh, this is pretty easy. Got in our head who we need to have a communication with. When it came time to actually put pen to paper, it was a months-long process to try to go through and get all of those people identified, tabletop with them ahead of time so they knew when they were going to be called upon, what the ask of them was going to be, where they needed to be included in the conversation, and where they needed to be, because just for a cybersecurity incident, that's one thing. When you add in potentially a ransomware attack and you add in the decision-making process about having to make a ransom payment and all of the implications, legal, and business and reputational implications that come there about paying a ransom, there's an entirely new set of people that need to be escalated to. And so it's really important that that's something that's continuously reviewed, and it shouldn't be the cyber team making or the security team making those decisions in isolation. There are so many other people in the business, in your treasury department, that have to be involved, in your CFO's office that have to be involved and have to be escalated. And so because that's so tricky, you don't want to be waiting to do that at all at the time of a security incident. It really needs to be an exercise in and of itself, with the incident response team in the legal department, and really your CFO's office.
It's all about the readiness.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All about the readiness.
And backups for all those people.
Yes, that part, right? Like just having the contact information of your security team that's not stored on your network, significantly helpful, right?
Mm-hmm.
This goes back to kind of like those core foundational things that really, really can get us in trouble or help us on the back end. So speaking of cyber risk intelligence, I want to jump back into that. Can security leaders leverage that for funding requests?
I think they can. It just has to be contextualized properly, right? Again, if you walk in, talking about some of the strange names that are out there on these things, but if you have a foundation, if you have a way of talking about cyber risk that is intuitive, easy to understand, does some of the education on the fly, if it's data informed, by your programs, enriched by maybe cyber loss data as well, and projected across risk models that are in wide acceptance, I think you can clearly make the case that, we may have some gaps here. And if we do, you can then begin to say there are a few different ways to address those gaps. You don't have to go in with like a monolithic approach and say, we absolutely need this, or we need that, or we need the other thing. You can, game it out a little bit and say, here's one way to do it. Here's another way. And here's some of the ROI over time. So our most recent release really concerned the ROI over time, and it concerned financial modeling. I think in the SEC, their release, they did say, do you understand some of the financial implications of the practice of cyber risk? I think it's very important for security teams, for the organization to all be bought in on the financial implications of these things. Now, because you're modeling risk, you're not saying this is absolutely going to happen. You have to have a way to talk about what could happen, what the possible losses could look like, and what is the menu of things you can do to, increase resilience, strengthen your systems, protect your brand, protect your reputation, all of the corollary impacts, the primary, the secondary impacts as well. So there has to be a story. Cyber risk is a story at the end of the day. And a lot of what we've done over the last year is to just put more tools into those storytellers' hands.
So I'd add on to Patrick's statement there. And so one of the things is, if you have the intelligence and you have the numbers, particularly if those are specific to your organization, you can't ignore them once you get them. And I think that's the other part that's really important, because if everything is telling you that you need to be focusing on phishing or whatever, and you have massive failures there, and that's where all of your security incidents are coming from, and then you're not taking and advocating for any budget related to phishing remediation, and then a regulator comes in and looks and says, you knew that phishing was your number one security risk, you had analytics that pointed to that, you ignored those, you all didn't prioritize that, that opens an entirely different can of worms. And that really does go into what they're looking for, in some of these disclosures around really having a true end-to-end management program, risk management program. And so from a legal risk and a compliance risk, it's just really important to know once you get that data, you're going to have to action it. You can say, this risk hasn't been materialized yet, or, we think that there's some other considerations and we need to handle it, to Patrick's point, in a different way. And that may be prioritized at a different level or a tier, but you can't ignore it. You're going to have to disposition the data and make sure that you have a process to be able to do that.
I think it's interesting, you think about reputational risk from either you're going to be in the paper because you were part of the bad actor's threat, or you're going to be in the paper because a regulator came back and audited you and said, hey, you didn't do this, right? So you have two aspects of this reputational risk and ways you can be on the front page of the newspaper, both from the bad guys and the regulators, constantly assessing you and trying to find your weak points and unfortunately disclosing them. So when you bring things to the board like this with a limited budget, I would have alongside you, here's option 1, 2, and 3. Here's what's going to cost. And here's what could also be your compliance risk, your legal risk, your reputational risk, with maybe some sort of like Harvey ball, red, yellow, green, and say, this is, if you want to accept it and only spend this much, this is what we could be exposed to. Not just being part of a bad actor threat, but also from a regulator disclosure.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, along the lines of budget, of course, security leaders are concerned about budget. We have another audience question. How do you implement defense in depth with a limited budget?
I think it's going to come back to build or buy. Honestly, you can think about, and that's something you have to bring to your board. You really need to bring together the stakeholders and assess, again, what is your risk? What are we trying to protect against? And with our budget, what can we implement, both from building it ourselves or potentially buying it? And we have to realize that if you do outsource this, right, there's a potential that cost could also increase as those services become more in demand. But if you build it too, those costs could increase as you try to keep things more up to date, potentially have to hire more people, bring in more expertise. So I think it's not just a one snapshot in time when you bring it to your board. I would think 1 to 3 to 5 years out of what you think this cost is going to be, and make sure you have those discussions and really put it to them. I mean, if they, again, that reputational risk is going to be there, but if you're really stressed out about how much budget you have and what's your limitations, make sure that you are fully disclosing what you think those risks could be to your board, and put that in the hands of that executive team.
Yeah, I can't echo that more. I think that this is part of the risk management program that's being codified right now, right? Yep. Making sure that it aligns with the budget. Very few companies are going to have enough money to cover all their risk and do the level of defense in depth that they would want. And even if they do, to Patrick's point, there are resource shortages. So you likely are not going to have the resource that you need to be able to do it. And so you really do have to look at those analytics, understand what your risk profile is saying, understand what your highest risks are. And if you have $1 million worth of security risks that need to be mitigated, but you're only going to get $750,000 worth of money, something is going to fall below the line. And you really have to identify and prioritize what the riskiest areas are, and then have that conversation with your leadership team and said, this is still what's on the table. This is the risk that's not going to be mitigated. Understand what the potential impact is, and they need to be able to accept that risk. And more importantly, you as a CISO who is doing that and having those conversations need to have all of that documented, where you have gone to management, they've accepted the risk, you can show that you've presented that information, and so you are trying to, make sure that you're protected under Delaware law or these other things to show that you've escalated. Leadership has determined the risk. They have the ability to accept the level of risk, but you want to make sure the risk is being accepted at the right level. And that generally is not going to be at the operational level with the CISO. So you need to make sure that all that is documented.
That's
and there's personal attestations out there, right? They're asking for you in your officer role to sign a personal attestation, and oftentimes you have to disclose those gaps. So make sure that's also part of your board communication. Like, I personally, in your role as CISO, will be attesting that we have these gaps. So you really want to make sure that you're, aware, sharing and communicating to all levels of management so they can make a properly informed decision.
That's right. Figure out where your juice is going to be worth the squeeze. That is going to wrap up today's panel. I hope that you thoroughly enjoyed today's session. Thank you to each of our wonderful panelists. And if you're interested in chatting more with some of us, we've got a 30-minute networking break after this session. Feel free to join us in the networking and read area immediately after this, and stay cyber strong, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks.